The sun over Dust Haven was a pour of molten copper, spilling heat onto a land that seemed made of little else. Red dust, fine as flour, coated everything the tired planks of the boardwalk, the sweat-slicked hides of tethered horses, and the bottom inch of every glass window along the main street. The air, thick with this dust, carried the mingled scents of hot leather, cattle tallow, and the bitter smoke from the smithy. A train whistle moaned in the distance, a weary sound that promised little and delivered less. Wooden signs creaked on their hinges, their painted letters faded by the relentless glare. Pike Mercantile, Crow's Saloon, Hale Sheriff Office, Livery Stable. Each name was a small kingdom in a realm of thirst and grit. Into this kingdom, a rickety wagon, pulled by a single exhausted horse, delivered Abigail Wynne. She stepped down onto the street, her movements deliberate, as if she were conserving every ounce of energy for the long road ahead. Dust settled on the hem of her dark traveling skirt. She carried a single canvas suitcase, its corners softened with wear, and she supervised the unloading of her most precious cargo with a fierce, quiet attention, an old Singer sewing machine, its black iron body gleaming dully in the oppressive light. She paid the driver, her purse snapping shut with a sound of finality, and watched the wagon rattle away, leaving her utterly alone in the center of the world's attention. She found a room for rent, not a proper storefront, but a small, sun-baked space tucked behind the sprawling Pike Mercantile. It was little more than a box, but it had a sturdy door and a window that looked out onto an alley, with a borrowed broom and a bucket of precious water. She scrubbed the place clean of the last tenant's memory and set up her life. A hand-painted sign, simple and neat, was hung from a nail by the Mercantile's side entrance, Abigail's Stitch and Mend. Her days settled into a rhythm dictated by the needs of the town. She patched the thick leather chaps of cowboys, the canvas of prospectors' bags, and the delicate lace on the Sunday dresses of the town's more respectable women. She was quiet, polite, and her work was flawless. Her stitches were small and even, her repairs stronger than the original fabric. People spoke to her, but she offered little of herself in return, answering questions with a nod or a brief, pleasant response that invited no further inquiry. She was a presence, but not yet a person in the town's collective mind. That began to change on a Tuesday afternoon. A young cattle hand, no more than 16, was thrown from his horse just outside of town and dragged a dozen yards. His friends carried him in, his thigh laid open by a cruel stump. They were headed for the saloon to pour whiskey on it when they passed her sign. One of them remembered his mother saying the new seamstress was deft with a needle. They laid the boy on the floor of her small shop, his face pale with shock, blood soaking through his denim trousers. The women who had gathered at the sound of the commotion expected Abigail to swoon or shriek. Instead, she knelt by the boy's side, her face calm. She sent one of the men for the cleanest water he could find and another for a bottle of carbolic acid from the Mercantile. While they were gone, she used her sharpest shears to cut away the bloody fabric, her touch gentle but firm. When the supplies arrived, the town saw something new. They saw her wash her hands meticulously before cleansing the wound, her movements practiced and efficient. They watched as she took a needle, not from her sewing kit, but one she sterilized in the flame of an oil lamp, and began to close the gash with the same precise stitches she used on fine silk. She bound the wound with clean strips of cotton, instructing the boy's friends on how to keep it from festering. She had saved his leg, and perhaps his life, and she asked for nothing in return. From the shaded porch of the sheriff's office across the street, Ethan Hale watched it all. He sat tilted back in a sturdy wooden chair, a mug of black coffee, long gone cold, resting on the rail beside him. It was his habit to observe the town, to know its currents and its eddies before they turned into a flood. He had seen Abigail arrive, had noted her quiet industry and the way she kept to herself. Now, he saw this new dimension. He saw competence and a startling lack of panic. His gaze was cautious, as it was with all newcomers, but it held no judgment. Dusthaven was a hard place. It tested people. He was content to watch and see how she met that test. Not all observation in Dusthaven was so impartial. Later that evening, in the smoky gloom of Crow's saloon, two figures sat at a corner table, their voices low and pitched for privacy. Silas Crow, the saloon's owner, was a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. He dealt in whiskey, cards, and information, and he had a keen understanding of how one could be leveraged to acquire the other two. Across from him sat Widow Pike, the owner of the mercantile and the town's self-appointed matriarch of morality. Dressed in severe black silk, she fanned herself slowly, her expression one of pious concern that barely masked a core of cold ambition. "The location is perfect," she murmured, her eyes flicking toward the window. "Right next to the public well. With the railroad bringing in more traffic, control of that water access is paramount." Silas leaned forward, the lamplight glinting off the pomade in his dark hair. "The seamstress is the only obstacle. Her little shop backs right up to the plot you want. Pike, if you own the mercantile and the land behind it, you control the whole corner." "She seems determined," Widow Pike said, a note of distaste in her voice, "and after that display today, she'll have the sympathy of the lower sort." Silas chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Sympathy is cheap, Martha, cheaper than dirt. A reputation, however, is a fragile thing in a town like this, especially for a woman alone. A bit of carefully placed talk, a whisper of a less than savory past, people will turn on her. She'll be eager to sell her lease and move on. And you'll get your land for a song. Leave it to me. I know how to clear the path." This was the way of Dusthaven. A veneer of strict, church-going morality laid thin over a bedrock of raw self-interest. The men drank and fought and worked themselves to an early grave, while the women maintained a rigid social order, their primary currency the good standing of their names. The town had a small church, presided over by a young pastor whose sermons on brotherly love often felt thin against the harsh realities of frontier life. He meant well, but his hands were soft and his understanding of sin was more academic than practical. In her small room, Abigail was immune to these machinations, but not to the anxieties that churned within her. She lit a single candle and took a worn, folded letter from a small wooden box. It was the last letter from her husband, written from the hospital in Kansas where the smallpox had finally taken him. He had been a doctor, a kind man who believed in science and the goodness of people, beliefs that had been sorely tested. The epidemic had bred fear, and fear had bred suspicion. When medicines went missing, blame had been cast about like poisoned seed, and some of it had landed on her. There had been no proof, only whispers, but it had been enough. After his death, she had left, vowing never again to be at the mercy of gossip, never again to ask for anyone's pity. "This time will be different," she whispered into the quiet of the room, her fingers tracing her husband's faded script. The letter was her shield, a testament to a life of honor, a reminder of who she was when the world tried to tell her otherwise. She would build a life here on the foundation of her own skill and her own resilience. She would owe no one. Outside, the vast, unforgiving beauty of the West asserted itself. The sun had set, leaving behind a bruised purple sky that slowly deepened to an immense, star-dusted black. The heat of the day bled out of the earth, and a chill crept in from the plains. From the far-off hills came the yipping and howling of a coyote pack, a lonely, primal sound that spoke of hunger and survival. It was the music of this new world, and Abigail listened until it became a part of the silence inside her. The next morning, she went to the mercantile to purchase a box of heavy-duty nails for repairing a saddle. Mr. Pike, a man who lived in the considerable shadow of his wife, was measuring out flour for a customer. Abigail waited her turn, and when he finally looked at her, he quoted a price for the nails that was nearly double what it should have been. A few men loitering near the counter watched with interest. expecting her to either pay the inflated price or retreat. Abigail simply met Mr. Pike's gaze and gave him a small, wry smile. "That's a bit steep. Mr. Pike," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You know, if nails were as cheap as gossip in this town, I would buy a whole bucket full." A surprised bark of laughter came from one of the men. "Mr." Pike's face flushed a dull red. He grumbled something under his breath and recalculated the price, giving it to her for what it was worth. As Abigail paid and left, she could feel the men's eyes on her, but the look in them had changed. It was a small victory, a tiny seed of respect planted in the town's hard soil. Later that day, a group of young ranch hands, flush with a week's pay, began to get loud and reckless near the sheriff's office, their talk turning to wild plans for the evening. Ethan Hale stepped out onto his porch, not with his gun drawn, but with an air of immense, unshakable calm. He did not raise his voice. "Boys," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through their drunken chatter, "your fun is your own business until it becomes everyone's trouble. You would do well to remember that out here. The law is not just a set of rules in a book. It is the backbone that keeps a place like this from being broken in two by the first big wind that blows through." The young men quieted, shuffling their feet. They saw the sense in his words, or at least the iron resolve behind them. They tipped their hats and moved on, their boisterous energy subdued. Ethan watched them go. Then his eyes drifted across the street to the small, hand-painted sign for Abigail's Stitch and Mend. He took a slow sip of his now bitter coffee, his expression unreadable. The wind was always blowing in Dust Haven. He just wondered from which direction the next big gust would come. The social event of the season, a fundraiser to put a new roof on the church, was held, with a certain frontier irony, in the largest space available for public gathering, the main floor of Crow's Saloon, on a Saturday night. The gambling tables were pushed against the walls and covered with donated quilts. The spittoons were removed, and the air, for once, was thick with the scent of church lady perfume instead of stale beer and cheap cigars. It was a strained affair. Men stood awkwardly in their Sunday best, their hands unsure of what to do without a whiskey glass in them, while their wives served watery punch and dry cakes, casting disapproving glances at the painted women on the saloon's gaudy murals. Abigail Wynne was there, not as a guest, but as a necessity. The hem on Widow Pike's formidable black dress had come loose at the last minute, and Abigail had been summoned to perform the emergency repair in a small back room. She worked quickly and silently, her needle a tiny silver fish darting through the heavy fabric. When she was finished, Widow Pike had inspected the seam with a critical eye, pronounced it adequate, and paid her with a few coins, the transaction feeling more like a dismissal than a thank you. Abigail had lingered for a moment, standing near the doorway, an invisible observer to the town's forced merriment. The evening was winding down when the first crack appeared in the fragile peace. Widow Pike, who had been the center of attention all night, let out a theatrical gasp, her hand flying to her throat. She announced, in a voice pitched to carry across the suddenly silent room, that her mother's silver jewelry box was missing. It had been on a small table near the entrance, a collection plate of sorts for the larger donations. Now, it was gone. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Hale, who had been leaning against a wall, a silent guardian of the peace, straightened up. But before he could take control of the situation, Widow Pike's eyes, wet with crocodile tears, found Abigail standing by the door. "I remember now," the widow declared, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "When I was in Kansas visiting my sister, I heard whispers about a woman who looked much like her, a woman who had a certain reputation, who left town under a dark cloud after some trouble. The implication, as poisonous as it was vague, hung in the air. All eyes turned to Abigail. She felt the weight of their collective stare, a physical pressure. She saw suspicion bloom on faces that had, just hours before, offered her polite nods. Several of the town's leading matrons, who had been considering hiring her for new dress work, now looked at her as if she were a snake that had slithered into their garden party. The boycott was instantaneous and unspoken. Abigail's face remained a calm, unreadable mask, but inside, a cold dread began to seep into her bones. She met Widow Pike's gaze for a long moment before turning and walking out of the saloon, her back straight, her head held high. She did not run. She would not give them that satisfaction. The next morning, the spark of insinuation had been fanned into a full-blown fire of gossip. The story changed and grew with each telling. By the time the sun was high, the tale being told over backyard fences was that Abigail was a notorious woman from Kansas, a thief who preyed on good, church-going folk. Then came the evidence. One of Silas Crow's bartenders, while sweeping the saloon's grand staircase, made a great show of discovering a small, telltale object. It was a short length of plum-colored ribbon, the very same distinctive shade that Abigail used to tie up her parcels of finished mending work. The bartender held it up for all to see, and the final nail was driven into the coffin of Abigail's reputation. It was proof, they said. She must have dropped it while making her escape with the jewelry box. The whispers grew louder, bolder. They followed her like a cloud of biting flies when she made her necessary trip to the well. That afternoon, the whispers turned into an act of overt hostility. On the whitewashed back wall of the Mercantile, the wall her own small shop abutted, someone had used a piece of charcoal to scrawl a single, ugly word in large, jagged letters, soiled. Abigail saw it when she stepped out for a breath of air. The word seemed to sear itself into her mind. For a moment, the world tilted, the dusty alleyway swaying around her. This was Kansas all over again. The same baseless accusation, the same public shaming. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered at a safe distance, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous condemnation. She saw their lips moving, heard the faint buzz of their judgment, just as a knot of men began to grow more agitated, their talk turning from accusation to action. Sheriff Ethan Hale's voice cut through the air. "That is enough. Go on about your business. There is nothing to see here." He did not shout, but his voice carried a weight that made people listen. He moved through the small crowd, not pushing, but simply occupying space with an authority that made them give way. He walked right up to the wall and stood for a moment, looking at the word. Then he turned to Abigail. His eyes were not filled with pity or accusation. They were steady, direct. "Mrs. Wynne," he said, his voice low and calm. "I would appreciate it if you would come with me to my office. We need to have a talk." She felt a tremor of fear, but she met his gaze without flinching. "Am I under arrest?" "Sheriff." "No," he said. "You are under a cloud of suspicion, and I aim to find out if it has any substance. My questions are meant to protect you, not to convict you. Please." The sheriff's office was a spare, clean space that smelled of coffee and old paper. He offered her a seat, but she remained standing. He did not press her. He moved behind his desk and leaned against it, his arms crossed. "Tell me about Kansas." "Mrs. Wynne," he said. It was not a demand. Her pride, the only thing she had left, rose up in her. She would not beg or weep. She would give him the truth, and he could do with it what he would. "My husband was a doctor," she began, her voice even. "We were in a small town when the smallpox hit. There was a field hospital. I helped him. People were dying and they were scared. When some medicine went missing, they needed someone to blame. The whispers started. After my husband died from the disease, I had no reason to stay and fight shadows. So I left." She reached into the small purse she always carried and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She laid it on his desk. "This is a receipt from Pike's Mercantile. It is for 3 yards of blue calico. It is dated for yesterday, and Mr. Pike marked the time on it himself. as I was his last customer before he closed for the fundraiser. The time is 7:15. I believe that is when Widow Pike's jewelry box was said to have been taken. Ethan picked up the receipt and studied it. He nodded slowly. This helps. I did not take her box. Sheriff, Abigail said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but losing none of its intensity. I have never stolen a thing in my life. Just then, the door opened and Silas Crow entered, a look of deep concern etched on his face. He nodded gravely to the sheriff and then turned to Abigail. My dear woman, he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. This is a terrible business, truly terrible. But the town is upset. I have spoken with Widow Pike. She is a forgiving soul. If you would just make a public apology, admit your lapse in judgment, I am certain she would be willing to speak to the pastor on your behalf, and we can put this all behind us. The audacity of the offer struck Abigail dumb. He was asking her to confess to a crime she did not commit, to trade her honor for a peace that would be built on a lie. The fire returned to her eyes. I will not, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. I will not apologize for something I did not do. Silas sighed dramatically. I was afraid you would be stubborn. It is a shame. He glanced at the sheriff, a look of shared masculine exasperation, before turning and leaving the office. He had done his work. He had offered a path to forgiveness, and she had refused it. To the town, it would be another sign of her guilt. The hours that followed were the longest of Abigail's life. The trickle of mending work she relied on dried up completely. 2 women who had left dresses to be altered sent their sons to retrieve them, unfinished. The small pile of garments on her work table dwindled until it was empty. She sat alone in the silence of her shop, the singer machine cold beneath her fingers, and felt the full weight of her isolation. She was once again an outcast, her livelihood strangled by whispers. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to cast long shadows down the alley, a grizzled old prospector named Jedediah shuffled up to her door. He was a man who lived on the frayed edges of the town, mostly ignored by its respectable citizens. He held out a threadbare coat, its elbow worn through. Ethan Hale had paid for the repair in advance, pressing 2 coins into Jedediah's hand. He had also given the old man a small, folded note to deliver to Abigail. She took the coat and the note. Inside, on a scrap of paper torn from a ledger, was the sheriff's blocky handwriting. It said only, "Put this on the account of the Justice Fund." Tears pricked at Abigail's eyes for the first time. It was not pity. It was a quiet, anonymous act of faith, a single candle lit in a vast darkness. It was one person in this whole town who was willing to wait for the truth. As she threaded a needle to mend the old man's coat, another visitor appeared at her door. It was young Tommy, the newsboy, a scruffy 10-year-old with ink stains on his fingers and a mischievous grin. He held up a penny. "Heard you were out of work, Mrs. Wynne," he said, his voice full of childish sincerity. He looked her right in the eye. "But say, if you really are a thief, do you think you could steal some of Mrs. Pike's fresh-baked pies? And if you do, could you maybe sew me a bigger bag to carry them in?" It was so absurd, so completely out of the blue, that a sound escaped Abigail's throat she had not made in days. It was a laugh, a real, genuine laugh, that started deep in her chest and shook her shoulders. The simple, ridiculous honesty of the boy had broken through her despair. "I will think on it." "Tommy," she said, a real smile finally touching her lips. "I will surely think on it." Across the street, Ethan Hale was not smiling. The sun had set, and he was in the saloon, not for a drink, but for answers. The place was mostly empty. He spoke to the bartender who had found the ribbon, a nervous young man named Frank. Frank's story was smooth, a little too smooth. Ethan's questions became sharper, more pointed, until the boy was sweating under the scrutiny. He learned nothing concrete, but he saw the fear in Frank's eyes. Later, as he was leaving, he saw one of Silas's regular men, a hard case named Lyle, wiping down a table. Ethan noticed something on the man's heavy leather glove. It was a faint, dark smudge. On a hunch, he walked over. "Missed a spot. Lyle," he said, gesturing to the table, as Lyle reached out to wipe it again. Ethan casually brushed his finger against the glove. When he pulled his hand away, a tiny trace of dark, greasy tarnish came away on his fingertip. It smelled faintly of polish and old metal. Silver polish. It was nothing, a smudge of dirt. It meant nothing at all. But as Ethan Hale walked out into the cold night air, he knew it was something. It was the first loose thread, and he was a man who knew just how to pull on a thread until the whole ugly tapestry unraveled. The sky began to bleed its color first. The brilliant, hard blue of the morning softened to a hazy yellow, then a sickly orange. A strange stillness fell over Dust Haven, a held breath before a sneeze. The wind, which had been a constant, nagging presence, died completely. Then, from the west, a low, dark line appeared on the horizon, a smudge of charcoal that grew with unnatural speed into a roiling, monstrous wall of red dust. The cry went up from the street. "Duster coming!" People scrambled for cover, merchants frantically pulling in their goods, mothers screaming for their children. Abigail was in her small shop, securing her window, when she saw a young laundress, Mary, struggling with a heavy handcart piled high with clean linens. A sudden, violent gust of wind, the storm's herald, caught the cart and sent it tipping over. Mary fell hard, her head striking the edge of the wooden boardwalk as the first wave of blinding, choking dust enveloped the street. Without a second thought, Abigail ran out into the maelstrom. She covered her mouth and nose with her sleeve, her eyes squinting against the stinging grit. She found Mary dazed and crying, a nasty gash on her forehead already welling with blood and grime. Abigail half lifted, half dragged the girl into the shelter of her shop, slamming the door shut just as the full fury of the storm hit. The world outside dissolved into a roaring, reddish-brown twilight. Inside, the air was thick, but breathable. Abigail gently cleaned the cut on Mary's forehead with what little clean water she had, her touch as steady as it had been with the injured cowboy. She applied a bit of salve and a clean bandage. The girl, shaking from shock and gratitude, could only stammer her thanks. Through the gaps in the doorframe, the wind howled like a legion of demons. For an hour they sat in the dim light, two women against the rage of the elements. When the storm finally passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in a fine red powder, Abigail helped Mary gather the now filthy linens. She asked for nothing, but she had earned something invaluable, the fierce loyalty of the town's working poor, who saw in her not a thief, but a neighbor. Ethan Hale had spent the storm in his office, watching the world disappear. His mind, however, was on a different kind of obscurity. The next day, he paid a formal visit to Crow's saloon. It was mid-morning, and the place was quiet, citing a recent spate of petty thefts in the town. He demanded to see the saloon's financial ledgers. Silas Crow protested, all slick smiles and feigned offense, but he could not legally refuse the sheriff. The books were a mess of sloppy accounting, but Ethan was patient. He spent hours poring over the numbers, and what he found was not in the main ledger, but in a smaller, separate book tucked away in a desk drawer. It was a record of pawned items: watches, rings, a silver locket, a fancy pistol. Silas was running an unlicensed and illegal pawnbroking operation out of his back room. It was the perfect way to launder stolen goods. A silver jewelry box could easily disappear into such a system, its contents sold off piece by piece, its metal melted down and sold as anonymous bullion. While Ethan was digging into Silas's secrets, Widow Pike was marshaling her own forces. She held a meeting of the town's most influential ladies in her stifling, lace-curtained parlor. With a performance of trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, she spoke of the threat to their community's moral fabric, the danger of allowing a woman of questionable character to remain among them. She proposed the formation of a committee for town decency. Their first act, she announced, would be to circulate a petition demanding the town council expel Abigail Wynne within 7 days. The petition spread through the town like a fever. Women who had been on the fence, swayed by Abigail's quiet dignity or her kindness to the laundress, found themselves pressured by the formidable Widow Pike and her allies. To refuse to sign was to risk one's own social standing. The committee's campaign was to culminate in a public presentation of the petition in the town square. When the day came, Abigail knew she could not hide. To do so would be an admission of guilt. She walked out of her shop and stood by the public well, her hands clasped in front of her, and waited. Widow Pike, flanked by her committee, began to read a prepared statement, her voice ringing with self-righteousness. She spoke of protecting their daughters, of upholding standards, of excising a corrupting influence. As she spoke, the crowd grew, drawn by the drama. When she finished, she held up the petition, heavy with signatures. All eyes turned to Abigail. A hush fell over the square. Ethan Hale was there, standing on the steps of his office, his arms crossed. He did not move or speak, but his presence was a tangible thing. He was watching, letting this play out according to the town's own unwritten laws. Abigail took a step forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was so clear and steady that everyone heard her. "I did not come to Dusthaven to ask for your pity," she said, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the crowd. "I came here to work, to build a quiet life. I have harmed no one. I have taken nothing from no one. I am being judged on whispers and rumors, not on facts." She looked directly at Widow Pike. "I do not need your forgiveness. Madam, I need the truth, and I will not be driven from my home by a list of names born of fear and gossip." She said nothing more. She simply stood her ground, a lone figure of defiance. The force of her simple, unadorned statement left the crowd unsettled. There were no tears, no hysterics, just the quiet power of an innocent person refusing to be broken. That night, the response came in a different form. As Abigail was preparing to lock her door, a large, hulking man she had never seen before stepped out of the shadows of the alley. He smelled of cheap whiskey and menace. He did not touch her, but he stood in her way, his sheer size an act of intimidation. "Some folks think you ought to move on," he grunted, his voice a low rumble. "Town's got enough trouble without your kind. It would be healthier for you to be gone by the end of the week." Before Abigail could even react, another shadow detached itself from the doorway of the sheriff's office. Ethan moved with a speed that was startling in a man his size. He did not draw his weapon. He simply came to a stop beside the large man, his presence radiating a cold, lethal calm. "You must be from Tombstone," Ethan said, his voice conversational. "I can smell it on you. You're a long way from home. I suggest you start walking back." The hired man stared at Ethan, sizing him up. He saw something in the sheriff's eyes that made him reconsider his options. Without another word, he grunted, turned, and disappeared back into the darkness. Ethan watched him go, then turned to Abigail. "I will have a deputy posted in the alley tonight," he said. "You should be safe." "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice a little unsteady. As she turned to go inside, her door let out a long, agonized squeak from its rusty top hinge. She winced. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "Sounds like a sick cow," he observed. "It has been that way since I arrived," she admitted. "I have some axle grease in the stable," he said. "It will only take a minute." He returned a few moments later with a small tin and a rag. As he worked the grease into the hinge, his large, capable hands surprisingly gentle, their shoulders brushed. A small, unexpected current passed between them. He swung the door back and forth. It moved in perfect silence. "There," he said, looking at her. The light from her lamp spilled out into the alley, softening the hard lines of his face. "Better," For some reason, the simple, practical kindness of it, coming on the heels of such menace, struck Abigail as deeply funny. A small laugh escaped her. "It sounds like a door again, not a bellowing steer in distress." He chuckled. A low, warm sound she had never heard from him before. "Glad to be of service, ma'am." Their shared laughter hung in the cool night air for a moment, a small, fragile bridge built between two lonely people. Ethan's investigation, meanwhile, had led him to the town's only silversmith, a timid man named Peterson. Ethan did not accuse, he simply asked questions about the man's recent work. Peterson was evasive, but Ethan's quiet persistence wore him down. Finally, the smith confessed that Silas Crow had come to him a few days after the church fundraiser. He had brought a collection of old-fashioned silver items, brooches, pendants, and the like, and paid him well to melt them down into a single, unmarked bar. Peterson swore he did not know they were stolen. Ethan believed him, but he now had a direct link between Silas and the disposal of items that matched the description of the contents of Widow Pike's box. Just as Ethan felt he was closing in, Silas made a clever countermove. A young waitress from the saloon, a girl named Lucy, who was known to be in debt to Silas, came to the sheriff's office in a flood of tears. She confessed to stealing the jewelry box. She said she had been desperate, that she had pried the jewels from their settings and thrown the silver box into the creek. Her story was emotional and filled with regret, but Ethan noticed the inconsistencies. The details she gave about the box did not quite match the widow's description, and her timeline was vague. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut, that she was lying. He saw the terror behind her tears and knew she was being coerced. He could not prove it, but the false confession muddied the waters, giving the town an easy answer and making any further investigation on his part look like a personal vendetta. As the human drama played out, nature added its own relentless pressure. The summer had been long and dry, and the main town well was beginning to run low. The water that was drawn up was brackish and thin. The only reliable source of fresh water now was the small creek that ran a half-mile outside of town. And Silas Crow, using the profits from his various enterprises, had spent the past weeks buying up the parcels of the land that bordered that creek. The day after Lucy's confession, a new fence went up, strung with sharp, cruel-looking barbed wire. A sign was posted, "No trespassing. Water rights property of S. Crow." He was strangling the town, and he was doing it legally. The mood in Dust Haven turned grim. The whispers against Abigail were momentarily forgotten, replaced by a more immediate and universal anxiety. Despair was a tangible thing, thick as the dust that still coated every surface. It was then that Abigail Wynne made her move. She took the small amount of money she had saved, walked to the young pastor, and explained her plan. He was a good man, and he saw the wisdom in it. He gave her access to the church's small back kitchen and its wood-burning stove. She spent the rest of the day at the Mercantile, not the Pike's establishment, but a smaller, independent one at the far end of town. She bought sacks of beans, potatoes, onions, and a large ham hock. The next evening, as the sun began to set, a new sign appeared. This one hung on the back door of the church. It read, simply, "Hot soup. All are welcome." The first to arrive were the children, drawn by the savory smell. Then came the out-of-work miners, the laundresses, the old prospectors. Soon, a long, quiet line snaked from the church kitchen door. Abigail stood over a large pot, ladle in hand, her face flushed from the heat of the stove. She filled every bowl that was offered to her, offering a quiet word or a small smile with each serving. She was not offering charity. She was offering sustenance. She was responding to the town's hardship not with politics or petitions, but with the most basic act of community. As people ate, they talked, and for the first time in a week, they were not talking about a stolen box of silver or a woman's sullied reputation. They were talking about the drying well, the new fence, and the simple, undeniable goodness of a bowl of hot soup on a cool evening. The poison of the gossip began to feel thin and insubstantial when weighed against the reality of a shared meal. The whispers had not vanished, but for now, they had been silenced by the quiet, powerful clatter of spoons against empty bowls. The soup kitchen became the new heart of Dust Haven. Every evening, the weary and the hungry gathered behind the church, their faces illuminated by the warm, yellow light spilling from the kitchen door. Abigail's work was a quiet rebellion, a persistent act of grace in the face of accusation. Yet, in the silent hours after she had scrubbed the last pot and returned to her small room, the ghosts of Kansas would return. She would lie awake, the charcoal-scrawled word soiled burning behind her eyelids, and the fear would coil in her stomach. She saw the same pattern repeating: a community in crisis, a woman alone, and the seductive ease of a convenient scapegoat. She was fighting not just for her place in Dust Haven, but against the echo of a past that threatened to swallow her whole. Her growing trust in Sheriff Hale was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling. He had not condemned her, had even offered a small measure of support. But trusting a man with a badge felt like trusting the storm not to blow. From his office, Ethan Hale watched her. He saw the exhaustion she tried to hide, the strength in the set of her jaw as she served the very people who whispered about her. A part of him, a part he had thought long dead and buried with his wife, felt a pull toward that resilience. He remembered the cholera epidemic that had swept through their previous town, how helpless he had been, his authority useless against the microscopic enemy that had stolen his Sarah. He had failed to protect his own family. The thought of drawing Abigail deeper into his world, a world of violence and enemies like Silas Crow, felt like a betrayal of that memory. To care for her would be to put her directly in the path of the storm he was meant to control. So he kept his distance, a silent, conflicted guardian, the guilt of the past chaining him to the porch of his office. The standoff between them and their respective adversaries simmered. Widow Pike, incensed by the soup kitchen's popularity, would make a point of walking through the market when Abigail was buying supplies, her voice loud as she spoke to her companions about the importance of knowing where one's food came from and who had handled it. Abigail would meet the woman's venomous gaze with a calm, level stare and ask the grocer for the price of beans, her composure an unshakable fortress that infuriated the widow. Between Ethan and Silas, the tension was a taut wire. The sheriff made his presence in the saloon more frequent, not drinking, just watching, his quiet scrutiny a constant, unnerving pressure on Silas and his men. The Committee for Town Decency took their campaign to the streets, led by Widow Pike. A dozen women marched down the main street carrying crudely painted signs. "Protect our daughters." One read, "Decency is our law." Read another. The irony was lost on them, that in their crusade to protect the town's virtue, they were committing the far greater sin of persecuting an innocent woman. The spectacle divided the town further, forcing people to choose sides in a war of whispers. Then, nature chose a side of its own. After a long, brutal drought, the sky turned the color of a bruise. The clouds gathered, thick and heavy, and unleashed a torrent. It was not a gentle, nourishing rain, but a violent, angry downpour. The parched, cracked earth could not absorb the deluge. Water ran in sheets down the main street, turning the red dust to a thick, churning sludge. The small creek outside town, the one Silas had so cleverly fenced off, swelled into a raging, muddy river, with a groan of tortured timber. The town's main wooden bridge splintered and was swept away. The water, with nowhere else to go, surged into the low-lying buildings. It smashed through the swinging doors of Crow's Saloon, flooding the main floor with a foot of brown, debris-filled water. Chaos reigned. As the rain continued to fall, Abigail threw open the doors to her small shop, turning it into a makeshift aid station. With the young pastor's help, she moved her sewing machine to high ground and began helping those displaced by the flood. She established a new, larger soup kitchen in the church's main hall. the only large building on high enough ground to remain dry. Ethan, his face grim, was everywhere at once, organizing men to check on the outlying homesteads, pulling a panicked horse from a flooded stable. He ended up at the church, soaked to the skin, his face streaked with mud. He found Abigail directing a half-dozen women, her voice calm and clear amid the confusion, turning the chaos into order. She put a knife and a loaf of hard-crusted bread in his hands. "We need slices for the soup," she said, not as a request, but as a statement of fact. He took the loaf, his hands, so skilled with a firearm or the reins of a horse, suddenly clumsy and awkward. He sawed at the bread, producing a mangled, uneven chunk. He looked at the mess he was making, then at her, a flicker of exasperation on his face. Abigail paused, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "Sheriff," she teased gently, "are you trying to arrest that loaf of bread, or just make it talk?" The tension in his shoulders eased. A low chuckle escaped him, the first genuine sound of humor he had made all day. "I believe it is resisting, ma'am." The small moment of shared levity was an anchor in the storm, a quiet acknowledgement of their unlikely partnership in the heart of the town's crisis. The flood brought another disaster. The tracks just east of town, their foundations weakened by the runoff, gave way under the weight of the evening train. The engine and the first two cars tipped into the mud, a slow, screeching collapse. It was the supply train, and one car was full of barrels of industrial dye for the tannery. The other carried crates of kerosene lamps. Barrels and crates split open, spilling vibrant blue dye and flammable oil into the floodwaters, creating a bizarre and dangerous slick that coated everything it touched. In the muddy, chaotic aftermath, the true character of the town was laid bare. A railroad brakeman, a young man with a wife and a new baby, was found pinned beneath a derailed car. His death cast a pall over the town's struggle for survival. His wife, a fragile woman, was inconsolable. Abigail went to her, not with platitudes, but with a needle and thread. She took the woman's husband's best suit and, working by lamplight through the night, she altered it to fit the woman's father, so the family would have proper mourning clothes for the burial. The next morning, when Abigail returned to the church, she found a small pile on the step. Someone had left a bolt of black cotton fabric. Another had left several spools of black thread and a package of fine needles. There was no note. It was a silent, collective offering, a testament of faith from a community that was slowly, painstakingly beginning to trust its own heart over the poison of gossip. At Crow's saloon, the mood was foul. The flood had ruined his carpets, warped his floorboards, and left a layer of stinking mud on everything. Silas was losing money, and his temper was short. His man, Lyle, who had been tasked with moving goods to the second floor, had instead sampled liberally from the whiskey bottles. Drunk and resentful, he started boasting to the other patrons. "Do not you worry about old Lyle," he slurred, slamming his glass on the wet bar. "Silas thinks he is the only one with a plan, but I got my own nest egg. Enough silver to buy my own little plot of land. I do. A man just has to be in the right place at the right time." Ethan Hale was standing near the door, observing the cleanup efforts. He heard every word. He did not react, but the name of the metal lodged in his memory. Another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The silver from the jewelry box, melted down and paid out to Silas's cronies. Armed with the silversmith's confession and now Lyle's drunken boast, Ethan knew he had enough to act. He drew up a formal request for a warrant to search the saloon's back rooms and Silas Crow's living quarters. He took it to Judge Miller, an old, portly man who owed his position more to his social connections than his legal acumen. The judge read the document, his lips pursed. He was a regular at Widow Pike's Sunday dinners. He adjusted his spectacles and looked at Ethan over the rims. "Sheriff, this is flimsy. The word of a frightened silversmith and the ramblings of a known drunkard, Lucy. The waitress has already confessed to this crime. The case is closed. I see no grounds for a warrant. Request denied." Ethan stood frozen for a moment, the useless paper in his hand. He had followed the law, gathered the evidence, and presented his case, and the law, in the form of a compromised judge, had slammed the door in his face. He looked at the judge, at the smug certainty in the man's eyes, and understood. The official channels were blocked. The system was being manipulated from within. If he was going to find justice for Abigail Wynne, he would have to find a way around the very law he was sworn to uphold. The denial of the warrant settled like a block of ice in Ethan Hale's chest. The law, his law, had been bought and sold in a stuffy room by a judge more concerned with social standing than with statutes. He walked out of the courthouse into the muddy, flood-ravaged street, the useless document still clenched in his hand. He looked across the square to the church, where a steady stream of people still came and went, drawn by the promise of a hot meal and a dry place to sit. Abigail Wynne, armed with nothing but a ladle and an unwavering sense of purpose, was dispensing more true justice than he was with his badge and his gun. Her honor was not something that could be debated in a courtroom. It was being forged, hour by hour, in her tireless service to the very community that had scorned her. That night, Ethan did not go to the saloon. Instead, he made a series of quiet visits. He went to the blacksmith, a man whose daughter Abigail had treated for a nasty burn. He went to the independent grocer, a man who respected her for paying her bills on time when others ran up endless credit. He went to the liveryman, whose best horse Ethan had helped save from the flood. He spoke to them not as a sheriff, but as a neighbor. He laid out his suspicions about Silas Crow, the melted silver, and the coerced confession. He spoke of a justice that the official court refused to dispense. He asked them if they would be willing to listen, to weigh the facts when the time came, and to stand as witnesses to the truth, a shadow jury of honest men against a corrupt system. They all agreed. The town's official power might belong to men like Judge Miller and Widow Pike, but its conscience, he was discovering, belonged to its working folk. The flood had left a trail of devastation, but it had also washed away some of the town's petty divisions. The most urgent task was rounding up the scattered livestock. Cattle, spooked by the storm, were stranded in muddy hollows and on small islands of high ground. As darkness fell, a party of men and women, Ethan and Abigail among them, set out with torches and ropes. They worked for hours in the thick, clinging mud, the flickering torchlight casting long, dancing shadows. They were no longer the Committee for Town Decency versus the town pariah. They were simply people fighting for their collective survival, their shouts and calls to one another a testament to a community being reforged in the crucible of shared hardship. During the rescue, a section of the sodden bank near the creek gave way. Abigail, who had been helping to calm a frightened calf, lost her footing. The ground simply dissolved beneath her. Before she could even cry out, Ethan was there. He lunged forward, grabbing her around the waist and hauling her back onto solid ground, his own boots sinking deep into the mire. He did not let go immediately. For a moment, they stood there, covered in mud, the heat of the torches hissing in the damp air. In that instant, there were no words, only the solid, reassuring strength of his arm around her. It was not a gesture of romance, but of pure, instinctual protection, a statement more powerful than any declaration. He had been there, and he had kept her from falling. Their makeshift family began to take shape in the days that followed. Ethan's niece, a quiet, observant girl of 8 named May, had been orphaned 2 years prior when her parents' wagon had overturned during a river crossing. She lived with Ethan in the small house behind the sheriff's office, a solemn little shadow in his solitary life, after a long day of relief work. Abigail would often bring a small pot of stew or a loaf of bread to their door, unwilling to see them subsist on the sheriff's notoriously bad coffee and canned beans. One evening, Ethan insisted she stay and share the meal. They sat around the small, scrubbed pine table. The 3 of them, May, who rarely spoke to strangers, began to ask Abigail questions about sewing. Abigail answered her patiently, her voice soft. Ethan watched them, a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. He found himself talking, telling a story about his late wife, Sarah, and her disastrous attempt to bake a pie, a story he had not told in years. He spoke of her with a fond, gentle sadness, not the sharp-edged guilt that usually accompanied her memory. He realized, with a jolt of surprise, that the telling did not hurt. In the quiet, unassuming presence of Abigail and the child, the ghosts of his past seemed to recede, replaced by the simple, grounding reality of a shared meal. The turning of the tide against prejudice came from an unexpected quarter. Mrs. Gable. One of Widow Pike's most vocal supporters and a leading member of the committee, came to the church in a state of near panic. Her young son had a painful, swollen abscess on his hand from a splinter, and it was getting worse. The town's only doctor was miles away, cut off by the washed-out bridge. In her desperation, she swallowed her pride and sought out the one person in town she knew had medical skill. Abigail did not hesitate. She had Mrs. Gable bring the boy to her shop, where she gently lanced and cleaned the wound, her movements swift and sure. The boy, who had been crying in pain, quieted under her calm, confident touch. When she was finished, she showed the grateful mother how to properly bandage the hand and keep it clean. Mrs. Gable, humbled and ashamed, tried to press a silver dollar into Abigail's hand. Abigail gently pushed it back. "There is no charge," she said, her voice devoid of triumph or accusation. "I am just glad I could help your son." The act of forgiveness, unspoken but deeply felt, did more to dismantle the Committee for Town Decency than any argument could have. Within Silas Crow's camp, however, loyalty was beginning to fray. Silas, his saloon a muddy wreck and his illegal operations under the sheriff's watchful eye, grew increasingly paranoid. He cornered Lyle in the back room one afternoon, his voice a venomous hiss. He knew Lyle had been talking, boasting about the silver. He accused him of being a weak link, a liability. He reminded Lyle of a certain gambling debt, of other, darker secrets he held over the man's head. He pushed Lyle hard, backing him into a corner, his threats leaving the man pale and trembling. Silas thought he was ensuring the man's silence, but what he was really doing was transforming Lyle's fear into a volatile, desperate resentment. One quiet afternoon, after the frantic energy of the flood relief had subsided into a routine of rebuilding, Abigail stood outside her small shop. She was looking at a single, scraggly cotton plant that grew in a patch of dirt by the wall, a volunteer that had somehow survived the trampling of feet and the extremes of drought and flood. In the center of the plant, a single, perfect white blossom had opened. It was a small, stubborn miracle, a testament to the life that endures. It felt like a sign, a quiet promise that even in the hardest, most trampled ground, hope could still find a way to bloom. The young pastor found her there. He had been a constant, if sometimes flustered, presence at her side throughout the crisis. "I read about healing in the scriptures." "Mrs. Wynne," he said, his voice full of a newfound humility. "But you have taught me what it means. You have taught me that piety is not in a sermon, but in the boiling of water to prevent sickness. That charity is not just a collection plate, but a clean bandage." He had learned from her that humanity was not an abstract concept, but a series of small, practical actions. His faith, once a thing of words, was now grounded in the real, tangible work of keeping a community alive. Ethan saw her standing there from his porch. He saw the way the afternoon sun caught the lines of weariness and strength on her face. He saw the pastor speaking to her with a reverence usually reserved for the pulpit. He saw the small, hopeful cotton blossom by her door, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that this was about more than just a stolen box of silver. It was about the very character of Dust Haven, and he would not let it be defined by the lies of powerful people. He would see the truth brought into the light, no matter what it cost him. The peace that had settled over Dusthaven was a fragile, temporary thing, and it shattered in the space of a single heartbeat. It began with the discovery of an empty bed. Ethan had returned from his late patrol, the weight of the long day heavy on his shoulders, and had looked in on his niece, as was his nightly ritual. The small cot was empty, the blankets thrown back. A wave of cold dread, colder than any floodwater, washed over him. He called her name, first softly, then with rising urgency. The small house remained silent. He searched the yard, his lantern cutting a frantic swath through the darkness. Nothing. His mind raced, seizing on every dark possibility, every faceless threat that haunted the edges of a frontier town. Then, a memory surfaced, sharp and ugly Lyle, drunk and boastful, slurring on about a nest egg of silver. He remembered the way May would sometimes follow the goings-on of the town with a quiet, solemn curiosity. The connection clicked into place in his mind with the sickening finality of a jail door locking shut. He found their tracks near the back of the house, the small prints of May's boots alongside the larger, shambling prints of a man's. They led out of town, toward the creek. He did not waste time saddling his horse. He ran, his long strides eating up the dark, uneven ground, his hand resting on the worn grip of his pistol. Abigail, bringing a small basket with leftover bread and a jar of broth, saw the light on in the sheriff's house and the door ajar. She called his name, then May's, and was met with the same echoing silence. An unease settled over her. She saw the rumpled, empty bed, a half-eaten apple on the small nightstand, and knew something was terribly wrong. Stepping back outside, her eyes, now accustomed to the dark, caught the disturbed earth where Ethan had found the tracks. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She did not know the details, but she knew the shape of danger. Acting on pure instinct, she ran not to her own shop, but to the livery stable. She grabbed a coil of thick rope from a peg and a storm lantern from the wall. Her mind a clear, cold machine of practical necessity. She lit the lantern and followed the path Ethan had taken, the small circle of light bobbing frantically in the vast, oppressive darkness. Ethan reached the ravine by the creek, the air growing cool and damp. Below, in a rocky clearing carved out by the flood, a single lantern cast a conspiratorial glow. He saw them, Silas Crow, Lyle, and, huddled behind a rock, the small, terrified form of his niece. May. On a flat stone between the two men lay several crudely shaped bars of silver, their surfaces gleaming dully. "That is the last of it," Silas was saying, his voice a low growl. "Half for you, for your part in it, and for your silence." "I do not know." "Silas," Lyle whined, his voice trembling. "The sheriff, he has been watching me. And bringing the kid was not part of the deal. The girl is our insurance." Silas sneered. "She saw the buried treasure. She will keep her mouth shut if she knows what is good for her." "That is far enough. Crow!" Ethan's voice boomed from the edge of the ravine, freezing the scene below. He stood silhouetted against the night sky, a figure of pure, cold fury. Silas spun around, his hand instinctively going for the pistol tucked in his belt. Lyle yelped and stumbled backward. May let out a small, choked cry. "Always sticking your nose where it is not wanted." "Sheriff!" Silas snarled, his composure returning. He drew his pistol, but did not aim it at Ethan. He waved it casually in May's direction. "This is a private business transaction. I suggest you move on." "Let the girl go, Silas," Ethan said, his voice dangerously low. He began to pick his way down the steep, rocky incline. "Stay where you are," Silas shouted, a note of panic creeping into his voice. He fired the pistol, not at Ethan, but into the air, the sharp crack echoing off the rocks. The sound, the flash, the sudden violence of it was too much for the terrified child. May scrambled backward, away from the men, away from the gun. Her small boot slipped on a patch of wet, loose shale. With a cry of terror, she slid over the edge of a short, steep drop-off, a 10-foot fall onto the rocky creek bed below. At that exact moment, a second light appeared at the top of the ravine. It was Abigail, breathless from her run. The rope coiled over her shoulder, the storm lantern held high. She saw the scene below in a single, horrifying glance. Ethan scrambling down the rocks, Silas with a smoking gun, and the empty space where the child had been. Ethan did not hesitate. He reached the ledge where May had fallen and peered over. She was lying in a heap on the rocks, moaning softly. He could not climb down without risking a fall himself. "Abigail!" he shouted, his voice raw with fear. The rope. She was already moving, anchoring one end of the rope around a sturdy, exposed tree root. She tossed the other end down to him. He secured it around his waist and, without a moment's hesitation, lowered himself over the side. He landed lightly on the rocks beside his niece. He quickly checked her limbs, his touch surprisingly gentle. She was bruised and terrified. Her ankle twisted, but she was alive. Above them, another drama was unfolding. The flash from Silas's pistol had been more than just a sound. A tiny, glowing ember from the black powder had arched through the air and landed on a patch of ground near the creek bank. The earth, still saturated with the kerosene that had spilled from the train wreck, erupted. A line of blue and orange flame shot up with a greedy whoosh, illuminating the ravine in a hellish, flickering light. Lyle screamed as the fire spread, cutting off his escape route. He looked from the flames to the terrified, injured child below, to the cold, murderous look on Silas's face. Something inside him snapped. All the fear, the resentment, the buried shred of decency rose up in a single, desperate wave. "It was you!" he shrieked at Silas, his own pistol suddenly in his hand, shaking but aimed at his boss. "You made me do it. It was all you." Silas stared at him, momentarily stunned by the betrayal. "You fool!" Ethan, holding May gently in his arms, called up to Abigail, "Pull us up slowly." With the fire roaring behind her, Abigail braced herself, her hands gripping the thick rope, and began to pull. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she did not falter. "Below!" Ethan used his feet to walk up the rock face, shielding May's body with his own. The jewelry box Lyle was sobbing now, the words tumbling out of him like floodwater. "He made me take it, said we would use it to get the widow to help us push the seamstress out so they could get her land. The land by the well." Silas, seeing his entire scheme unraveling, made a desperate move. He lunged for Lyle, trying to wrestle the gun away. The two men struggled, their grunting forms silhouetted against the growing flames. As Abigail hauled Ethan and May over the ledge, she saw something glinting in the mud near where Silas and Lyle had been standing, while Ethan rushed to comfort his niece, wrapping her in his coat and whispering assurances. Abigail scrambled down a few feet. She reached into the mud and pulled out a small, bent piece of metal. It was a fragment of ornate silver, a piece of a lid, and on its tarnished surface, she could clearly see a single, engraved letter P. The struggle below ended as Ethan drew his own weapon. "Drop it!" "Silas," he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that could not be denied. Silas, seeing the game was up, threw Lyle aside and raised his hands. Later, after the fire had been beaten down and Silas was in handcuffs, they sat on the edge of the ravine, the acrid smell of smoke still hanging in the air. Abigail was gently cleaning a scrape on Ethan's cheek with a piece of cloth dipped in water from her canteen. Her hands were trembling slightly, the adrenaline finally leaving her. "We will bring it all into the light now," she said, her voice quiet but firm as she looked at the silver fragment in her other hand. "For May, and for this town." Ethan looked at her, at the smudge of soot on her cheek, at the fierce determination in her eyes. The smoke was making him cough, and his throat was raw. "Well," he rasped, a weak attempt at a smile touching his lips. "Next time I am thinking of proposing. I will try to find a much smaller fire to do it by." The joke was so unexpected, so utterly out of place in the aftermath of such terror, that Abigail let out a sudden, surprised peal of laughter. The sound broke the tension, a release of fear and relief that was more potent than tears. It was a sound that promised that even after the fire, life would go on. Back in town, Ethan did not put Lyle in the main town jail cell. He knew Silas had friends, and that Lyle's life was now in danger. He hid him in the locked storeroom of the livery stable, with a deputy standing guard outside. He took Lyle's formal, signed statement by the light of a single lantern, the man's voice shaking as he confessed to every sordid detail of the conspiracy between him, Silas Crow, and Widow Pike. By the next morning, the story of the fire at the creek and the sheriff's dramatic rescue of his niece was on everyone's lips. But other, more potent rumors began to circulate as well. Whispers of a confession. Whispers of a silver fragment with the letter P engraved on it. That afternoon, someone left a small, anonymous bunch of wild prairie flowers on the doorstep of Abigail's Stitch and Mend. The tide was beginning to turn. With Silas Crow behind bars, a deceptive quiet settled over Dust Haven, the kind of quiet that precedes a hailstorm. The town held its breath, waiting. They did not have to wait long. The counterattack came not from the jailed saloon owner, but from his respectable partner in crime, Widow Pike. Realizing that the tide of public opinion was turning against her, made a desperate, calculated move to regain control. She switched her battlefield from the dusty street to the stuffy confines of the town council chamber, a venue where her influence, unlike Silas's, remained potent. She filed a formal petition, citing an old and vaguely worded town ordinance about maintaining public morality. Her document was a masterpiece of sanctimonious prose, accusing Abigail Wynne of being a disruptive and divisive influence, whose continued public activities, namely, the soup kitchen, were creating social unrest. She demanded that the council issue a restraining order, effectively banning Abigail from all public gatherings and shuttering the church kitchen until a formal moral inquiry could be conducted by a board of her own hand-picked church elders. It was a brilliant legal maneuver, an attempt to use the town's own rules to silence the woman who was exposing its corruption. While the widow fought with paper and ink, Silas fought with fire. From his cell, through a bribe passed to a gullible young deputy, he sent a message to the dregs of his organization. A new rumor was seeded in the town's underbelly, a reward of $100 silver for anyone who could provide proof of the seamstress's thievery. He was not looking for proof. He was setting a trap. The reward was an open invitation for someone to plant stolen goods in Abigail's shop, or to catch her in the act of retrieving them, turning the victim into the perpetrator in one swift, violent stroke. The threat hung in the air, a poison that made good people lock their doors and bad people sharpen their knives. But the most direct assault was yet to come. It came late one night, long after the last bowl of soup had been served and the moon was a pale sliver in a black sky. Abigail was in her small shop, mending a child's blanket by the light of a single lamp, the rhythmic pull of her needle a small comfort in the tense quiet. The first sign of trouble was the smell of kerosene, sharp and acrid. Then came the sound of breaking glass, a bottle shattering against the wooden wall of her shop. Before she could even rise from her chair, a whoosh of sound and a hungry orange light filled the window. Flames, unnaturally fast, licked up the dry timber. Panic seized her for a heartbeat, cold and absolute. Then, her survival instinct took over. She grabbed the blanket and beat at the flames that were already curling under the door. But it was like trying to fight the tide with a teacup. The smoke was thick and blinding, clawing at her throat. Through the haze, her eyes fixed on one thing, her Singer sewing machine. It was not just a tool. It was her independence, her past and her future. The one thing of value she had carried with her into this town. Just as she was struggling to drag the heavy iron machine toward the back door, the front door splintered inwards. Ethan Hale burst through the smoke, his face a mask of grim determination. a wet burlap sack in his hand. He had seen the glow from his office and had run. The machine, Abigail choked out, her voice a raw whisper. He did not need to be told twice. Together, they wrestled the heavy machine through the narrow back doorway and out into the alley, just as a loud groan echoed from within the shop. With a deafening crack, the main roof beam, eaten through by the flames, gave way. The roof collapsed inwards, sending a geyser of sparks and embers into the night sky. They stood there in the alley, gasping for air, their face black with soot, and watched as Abigail's small life, her sanctuary, was consumed by the fire. The light of the inferno cast a stark, unforgiving light on the scene that unfolded. The townspeople, woken by the fire bell, had gathered, and they were divided. On one side, the blacksmith, the grocer, Mary, the laundress, and a dozen others from the poorer side of town rushed forward with buckets of water from the well. They formed a frantic, desperate line, their actions a clear statement of allegiance. On the other side of the street, a second group stood watching, their arms crossed, their faces impassive. Widow Pike was among them, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. Their silence, their stillness, was as loud and as clear as the fire itself. In that moment, the true soul of Dusthaven was laid bare, a community at war with itself. By dawn, the fire was out. All that remained of Abigail's stitch and mend was a blackened, smoking shell. Abigail stood before the ruins, her face pale, her dress stained with soot and water. She looked defeated, but as the first rays of the morning sun touched the wreckage, something shifted in her eyes. It was not hope, not yet. It was something harder, more durable. It was resolve. She walked away from the ruin, not toward the sheriff's office for protection, but directly to the church. She found the young pastor sweeping ash from the church steps. She spoke to him, her voice low but steady. An hour later, with the help of the blacksmith and his sons, a large canvas tent, normally used for revivals, was being erected in the small patch of grass beside the church. They moved her rescued sewing machine inside, placing it on a makeshift table of planks and barrels. Abigail took a piece of charred wood and, on a broad, unburnt plank, she wrote a new sign. She hung it from the tent flap. It read, "Mending, free for those in need." It was an act of profound defiance. They had burned her business to the ground, so she would turn her skill into a gift. She would not be cowed, and she would not be broken. The pastor, his own transformation now complete, watched her with an expression of deep admiration. That Sunday, he faced his congregation, which now included a nervous and shamed Mrs. Gable, but was conspicuously missing Widow Pike. He did not preach his usual sermon on abstract theology. Instead, he spoke directly to the women of the town. He read from the book of Proverbs, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction, about a woman of valor whose price is far above rubies. He spoke of honor, not as a fragile thing to be protected from whispers, but as a strong thing, built from acts of kindness, truth, and hard work. He never mentioned Abigail by name, but every woman in the room knew of whom he spoke. Ethan, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle on a different front. The fire had been the last straw. The local law was a dead end. He spent the entire day locked in his office, painstakingly compiling every piece of evidence. He had Lyle's signed confession, the silversmith's statement, the sworn testimony of the men who had heard Lyle's drunken boasts, and the small, bent piece of silver with the letter P engraved on it. He packaged it all, wrote a long, detailed letter, and sent his most trusted deputy on the long ride to the county seat, with instructions to deliver the package directly into the hands of the United States District Marshal. He was going over Judge Miller's head, appealing to a higher, and he hoped, less corruptible authority. His work was interrupted by the news that Lyle had vanished. The deputy guarding the livery stable had been lured away by a staged fist fight, and in those few minutes, Someone had sprung the lock on the storeroom. Silas Crow had reached out from his cell and silenced his key witness. Ethan organized a posse immediately. A small group of the men he trusted, the town's shadow jury. He found the tracks easily: 2 horses, one with a distinctive, worn shoe that left a nick in its print. They rode out, following the trail into the vast, empty plains. Before he left, he found Abigail in her tent, her hands already busy mending a pair of worn trousers. The setting sun cast long shadows, and a cool night wind was beginning to blow. He wanted to tell her to stay in the church, to lock the doors, to hide, but he looked at her, at the determined set of her jaw, at the steady, rhythmic work of her hands, and he knew he could not. She looked up at him, her eyes reading his intent. "Do not ask me to stop, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "The soup kitchen, this tent, this is my home now. This is my fight, too. Trust me to hold my ground here, while you go and do what you must." He looked at her for a long moment, seeing not a victim to be protected, but a partner to be trusted. "I trust you," he said, the words feeling more significant than any he had ever spoken. He turned to leave. Late that night, long after the posse had ridden out, Abigail was still at work, a small lantern providing the only light in the tent. The wind had grown cold, and she shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She heard a footstep outside and looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Ethan. He had ridden back, leaving his men to make a cold camp. He said nothing. He simply walked over to her, took off his own heavy sheepskin-lined coat, and draped it over her shoulders. The coat was warm from his body and smelled faintly of leather and wood smoke. It enveloped her, a solid, comforting weight. She looked up at him, her work forgotten in her lap. The small space of the tent suddenly felt intimate, charged with all the things they had never said. "Thank you, Sheriff," she whispered. "Ethan," he corrected her, his voice a low rumble. Their eyes met and held for a beat longer than was proper, a silent conversation passing between them. Then he turned and was gone, disappearing back into the night to hunt down the man who held the key to her freedom. But he had left his coat behind, a tangible promise that he would be back. The town square was not a courtroom, but on that day, it became one. The relentless midday sun served as the harsh, unblinking eye of judgment. There was no roof on the town hall to offer shade, its charred beams a stark reminder of the recent flood and fire. A makeshift podium, little more than a sturdy wooden crate, had been placed on the top step. Judge Miller, looking profoundly uncomfortable to be officiating in the open air, sweated in his heavy black robes. Ethan Hale stood before the assembled town, a small collection of items laid out on a table beside him. He was not wearing his usual calm, observational expression. His face was carved from granite, his eyes holding the cold, hard light of conviction. He held up the bent piece of silver. "This was found at the creek on the night Silas Crow's criminal enterprise was brought to a halt," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "As you can see, it is engraved with the letter P, P for Pike." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Widow Pike, standing with a small group of her remaining supporters, scoffed loudly. A meaningless trinket. It could have come from anywhere. Ethan ignored her, picking up a leather-bound ledger. "This is the account book of our town silversmith, Mr. Peterson. It details a transaction, dated 2 days after the church fundraiser, in which Silas Crow paid to have a large quantity of antique silver jewelry melted down into unmarked bars. Jewelry matching the description of the items in Widow Pike's missing box." The widow's face paled slightly, but she held her ground. "Silas Crow is a criminal. His dealings have nothing to do with me." "And finally," Ethan said, his voice dropping, "I have the sworn, signed confession of Lyle, who is currently missing. A confession in which he details the entire plot, how he was hired by Silas to steal the box, and how the entire scheme was concocted with the full knowledge and cooperation of Widow Pike, for the sole purpose of driving Abigail Wynne from her property so that they could seize control of the land by the public well. "Lies!" the widow shrieked, her composure finally cracking. "Lies and slander from a desperate man and a compromised sheriff." Just as she spoke, a commotion at the edge of the square drew all eyes. A rider was coming in fast, not Ethan's deputy, but the United States Marshal himself, a tall, grim-faced man with two of his own deputies. Between them, looking pale and terrified, was Lyle. Ethan's posse, having tracked him down and rescued him from a remote line shack where he had been held, had met the federal officers on the trail. They brought Lyle before the podium. He was shaking, his eyes darting nervously from the marshal to the crowd, to the fury on Silas Crow's face, for Silas was no longer in his cell. Flanked by his lawyer, he had been brought to the hearing, a smirk of arrogant confidence on his face, believing his cronies had successfully silenced the only witness against him. That smirk now vanished, replaced by a look of pure venom. "Lyle," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm, tell them the truth." Lyle looked at the faces of the townspeople, at Abigail, who stood near the church tent, watching with a quiet, heartbreaking intensity. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "It is all true," he stammered, his voice thin but carrying in the sudden, absolute silence. "Silas paid me. He said the widow wanted the seamstress gone. They planned it all, the theft, the ribbon, all of it." He raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the creek. "The rest of the silver, it is not all melted. He made me bury a few bars out there, near the big cottonwood, as a holdout, in case things went wrong." It was over. The lie, so carefully constructed, had been utterly demolished. Silas Crow knew it. In that moment, all his cleverness, all his schemes, deserted him. He was reduced to the cornered animal he truly was, with a guttural roar of fury. He lunged, not at Lyle, but at the deputy standing nearest to him. His hand shot out, grabbing the deputy's pistol from its holster. The crowd screamed, a single collective gasp of terror, and surged backward. Silas spun, the gun in his hand, his eyes wild, looking for an escape, for a target, for a way to reclaim control through brute force. Ethan moved. He did not seem to hurry, yet he covered the 10 feet between them in a blur of motion. It was not a fight. It was a disarming, precise, and brutally efficient. His left hand slapped the gun upwards, deflecting the barrel. His right hand locked onto Silas's wrist, twisting it with an expert, bone-grinding pressure. His body moved with Silas's, using the man's own momentum to spin him off balance. The pistol fired, the shot deafening in the enclosed space of the square. High above their heads, the rope on the town flagpole jerked violently. Then one end went slack. The flag, the symbol of their young nation, slid halfway down the pole, where it hung, askew and wounded. The entire square had held its breath. Now, they let it out in a shaky, unified sigh. The gun clattered to the steps of the town hall. Silas Crow was on his knees, his face contorted in pain and disbelief, Ethan's grip like iron on his shoulder. The physical danger had passed, but the moral reckoning had just begun. Abigail Wynne stepped forward from the crowd. She walked past the disarmed criminal, past the sheriff, and stopped directly in front of Widow Pike. Her voice, when she spoke, held no malice, only a profound and terrible clarity. "You called me soiled," she said, her eyes locked on the widow's. "You wrote it on a wall for all to see, but it was your hands that were dirty all along. You have done more than try to ruin my name. You have tried to poison the very soul of this town, to turn neighbors against each other for your own greedy purpose. You have smeared your own honor with the mud you tried to throw at me." A voice rose from the crowd. "It was Mrs. Gable. She is right," she called out, her voice trembling but strong. "That woman saved my son's life." Then another, Mary, the laundress. She pulled me from the dust storm. She sheltered me when no one else would. The young pastor stepped onto the porch of the town hall. She has fed the hungry and comforted the afflicted. She has shown this town the true meaning of Christian charity, while others have hidden their greed behind a mask of piety. The dam of silence broke. The silversmith, Peterson, his voice shaking, confirmed to the crowd that he had melted the silver on Silas's orders. The story was no longer a rumor, but a chorus, a collective truth spoken by the very people who had once been swayed by the lie. In the midst of this rising tide of truth, Ethan Hale did something that stunned the entire town into silence once more. He released his hold on Silas, letting the deputies take him. He walked to the makeshift podium. He reached up and, with a deliberate motion, unpinned the silver star from his chest, his badge, the symbol of his office, of the law itself. He placed it carefully on the wooden crate, the metal making a small, definitive sound in the still air. He turned to face the crowd, but his eyes were on Abigail. He walked down the steps until he was standing before her. "A name is a fragile thing," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, quiet emotion that no one in the town had ever heard from him before. "It can be broken by whispers. It can be tarnished by lies." He looked around at the faces of his town. Then his gaze returned to her, soft and unwavering. Her name was tarnished by gossip. "So I want you all to hear me, loud and clear." He took her hand, his large, rough palm enclosing hers. "The sheriff is marrying her. In front of the whole town." It was not a question. It was a declaration, a statement of fact as solid and unshakable as the mountains on the horizon. It was a shield, an armor, a fortress built of his own honor, offered to protect hers. "Abigail Wynne," he said, his voice softening so that only she could hear. "Will you have me?" Tears welled in her eyes. Tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a profound and overwhelming relief, of a joy so intense it was painful. She looked at this man, at his steady eyes, at the strength and decency that radiated from him. She was not accepting a shield. She was accepting the heart of the man who had seen the truth of her all along. "Yes, Ethan," she whispered. "Yes." A sound erupted from the crowd, a collective sob that was half joy, half shame. It broke apart into applause, into cheers. People were crying openly. One of the women from the Committee for Town Decency stepped forward, her face streaked with tears, and stammered an apology. Another followed. The poison was being washed away. As the United States Marshal clapped the irons on Silas Crow's wrists, and his deputies formally arrested a pale, trembling widow Pike for conspiracy, the young pastor, his face beaming, ran to the church. A moment later, the church bell began to peal, its joyous, clanging notes rolling out across the sun-drenched square, a sound of judgment rendered, and of a new and better day beginning. There was no pause, no retreat into private contemplation. The wedding happened right there, in the sun-scorched square, a seamless continuation of the verdict that had just been rendered. The pastor, his face still flushed with the righteous fire of his testimony, took his place on the steps of the ruined town hall. The townspeople, their emotions a raw mix of shame, relief, and a dawning, fragile joy, did not disperse. They became the congregation, silent witnesses to the mending of the honor they had so recently helped to tear. There were no formal decorations, but the women and children, as if moved by a single, unspoken impulse, ran to the edges of the town and returned with their hands full of wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, prairie verbena, and the sunny, cheerful faces of black-eyed Susans. They pressed them into Abigail's hands, laid them on the steps, and tucked them into the splintered timbers of the town hall. Long trestle tables, salvaged from the church basement, were dragged into the square and quickly laden with whatever people could offer: loaves of cornbread, jars of pickled vegetables, a wheel of cheese from a nearby dairy farmer. It was a humble, impromptu feast, an offering of communal atonement. The blacksmith, a man of few words, disappeared into his smithy and returned a short time later. He approached Ethan and pressed a small, dark object into his hand. It was a ring, forged from a single horseshoe nail, heated and hammered and twisted into a simple, elegant spiral. Its surface had been filed and polished until it shone with a soft, dark luster. It was a thing of utility and strength, transformed into a symbol of beauty and permanence. As Abigail and Ethan stood before the pastor, the late afternoon sun casting long, forgiving shadows, the young man of God fumbled with his prayer book, his hands still shaking from the day's emotional turmoil. The book slipped from his grasp, falling to the dusty steps with a soft thud. A collective gasp went through the crowd, a fear that this small mishap might be a bad omen. The pastor's face turned a brilliant shade of crimson. Ethan, however, simply smiled and leaned in to whisper to Abigail. His voice a low rumble meant only for her. "As long as we have credible evidence of our intent, I think we can proceed." A genuine, unburdened laugh escaped Abigail, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness that seemed to lift the last of the tension from the square. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You always were good at finding the evidence." "Sheriff," with the blessing of the town and the grace of a slightly flustered pastor, they were married. Ethan slid the cool, solid weight of the horseshoe nail ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. In the week that followed, the remaking of Dust Haven began in earnest. Ethan Hale, his badge once again pinned to his chest, did not simply return to the old ways of enforcing the law. He gathered the men he had come to trust: the blacksmith, the grocer, the liverymen in his office. He formally deputized them, not as full-time lawmen, but as an independent citizens committee, an investigative body that would answer to the town's conscience, not to a compromised judge. Their first official act was to draft a new set of town ordinances. The regulations for pawnbroking were made ironclad, with every transaction to be recorded in a public ledger. Crow's Saloon was placed under strict supervision, its gambling operations curtailed, its business hours limited. The law in Dust Haven was no longer for sale. While Ethan rebuilt the town's civic structure, the townspeople came together to rebuild Abigail's life. A crew of volunteers, led by the blacksmith, cleared the charred wreckage of her old shop. They salvaged what timber they could and brought in fresh-cut pine from the small mill up the creek. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, a constructive, hopeful rhythm that replaced the angry shouts and whispers of the previous weeks. Mary, the laundress, organized a group of women to provide meals for the workers, a small, bustling echo of the soup kitchen that had saved them all. Abigail worked alongside them, her hands stained with pine sap, a smudge of sawdust on her cheek. She was not the town's charity case. She was the architect of her own future. When the new structure was complete, larger and sturdier than the one before, she hung a new, beautifully painted sign above the door. It no longer read simply "Stitch and Mend." The new sign, in elegant script, said "Win Stitchery and First Aid." Her two callings, her two identities, were now one and the same. The healing spread to the town's social fabric as well. The Committee for Town Decency, its name now a source of deep communal shame, was officially disbanded. In its place, a new organization was formed, at Mrs. Gable's suggestion. They called themselves the Needle and Soup Society. Their meetings were not held in stuffy parlors to discuss the moral failings of their neighbors. They were held in the church kitchen, where they organized meal deliveries for the sick and the elderly, and in the new meeting room at the back of Abigail's shop, where they sewed quilts for families who had lost everything in the flood. Their purpose was no longer judgment, but practical, hands-on work. Lyle, for his testimony, received a lenient sentence from the district marshal. His crime was not excused, but his courage was recognized. When he was released, he found he was not an outcast. Ethan offered him a job. The town's mail carrier had quit during the Troubles, and the position was open. It was a job that required trust and reliability, and the offer was Ethan's way of stating that a man's past did not have to be his future. Lyle accepted with a choked, grateful sob. He proved to be a changed man. Quiet, diligent, and sober. Every Thursday afternoon he would finish his route and go to the sheriff's house, where he would sit on the porch steps with May and help her practice her reading. It was his penance and his reward. A quiet, weekly ritual of rebuilding a life. Widow Pike was spared a jail sentence, but her punishment was, in its own way, just as severe. She was forced to sell the Pike Mercantile and her other land holdings to pay restitution to the town for the damages caused by the flood damages that the marshal's investigation proved were exacerbated by the illegal damming of the creek. With her wealth and her influence gone, she retreated to her remote, isolated farm. A lonely figure who served as a silent, cautionary tale that echoed through the town for years to come. Silas Crow was transferred to the federal prison at the county seat. The investigation into his ledgers, led by the U.S. Marshal, uncovered a web of other crimes: land fraud, blackmail, and a connection to a cattle-rustling ring. The consequences of his greed rippled outward, a final, dark legacy that the town was glad to be rid of. In the small house behind the sheriff's office, two solitary lives were learning the clumsy, beautiful dance of becoming one. Their mornings were a comedy of small domestic disasters. Ethan's coffee was thin and weak, and his attempts at making cornbread often resulted in something more akin to a blackened brick. Abigail, for her part, could not get used to the quiet weight of a man's presence in her kitchen, and would often find herself making enough stew to feed a dozen people. One morning, as Ethan chipped away at a particularly burnt piece of cornbread, he looked at her across the table, a mock-serious expression on his face. "You know," he said, "if I had known my sentence for proposing was a lifetime of this coffee, I might have reconsidered." Abigail laughed, the sound warm and easy in the morning sunlight. "And if I had known my reward for accepting was a steady diet of charcoal, I might have held out for a better offer." Their teasing was gentle, a comfortable language of affection that filled the small house with a warmth it had not known in years. A week after the wedding, Ethan, with the help of the blacksmith and a half-dozen volunteers, tore down the fence Silas Crow had built around the creek. The next day, they dug a new, deeper channel for the public well, ensuring it would not run dry again. The first bucket of clear, cold water was drawn by May, who laughed as it splashed over the sides onto her dusty boots. Soon, the well was once again the town's gathering place. But now the talk was not of scandal and suspicion, but of crop prices and church socials. The sound of children laughing as they played by the overflowing horse trough became the new and much preferred soundtrack of Dust Haven. Dust Haven was a town reborn, not into perfection, but into honesty. The silence that settled over the high plains was no longer the heavy, brittle silence of suspicion. It was the deep, quiet peace of a community that had faced its own reflection and chosen to be better. The people had learned that justice was not a single, dramatic moment of truth in the square. It was not the arrival of a marshal or the firing of a gun. Justice, they now understood, was the slow, persistent, daily work of decent people. It was the quiet, stubborn patience of Ethan Hale compiling his evidence. It was the unwavering courage of Abigail Wynne, serving soup to the very people who had slandered her. It was, in the end, the collective will of a town choosing to believe in the evidence of kind actions over the poison of convenient lies. And the love that had bloomed in the center of that fire was not a prize given, but a reward earned through that shared, terrible courage. The understanding of honor had changed, too. It was no longer a fragile, abstract concept for women, a thing that could be stolen by a whisper or defined by a committee. Honor, the town now saw, was a thing a woman built herself, with her own two hands. It was forged in the heat of a kitchen stove, measured by the steady rhythm of a sewing needle, and proven in the sweat and grit of service. The worth of Abigail Wynne was not something that could be debated by gossip. It was written in the clean bandages on a child's hand, in the sturdy patches on a worker's coat, and in the strength of the community she had helped to save from itself. The change was most profound in the two people at its center. Abigail, who had arrived in Dust Haven as a fugitive from her own past, terrified that the shadows of Kansas would consume her, was now a leader. She had stopped running. In the ashes of her burned-out shop, she had found her foundation. She not only reopened her business, she expanded it. She used her practical medical knowledge, born from the trauma of the epidemic, to teach the other women in the Needle and Soup Society. She held classes in the church basement, showing them how to properly boil water for sanitation, how to clean a wound, how to set a simple break. She had transformed the source of her deepest fear into her greatest strength. Ethan Hale was a man unbound, the grief for his first wife. Sarah had finally softened from a jagged wound of guilt into a gentle, bittersweet memory. He had hidden his heart for so long, fearing that to care for someone was to put them in danger, to fail them as he felt he had failed his wife. In Abigail, he had not found a replacement. He had found a new, whole, different kind of love. By placing his badge on that podium, by publicly staking his own honor on hers, he had broken free from his own prison of loss and had given himself permission to live and to love, fully and openly. The community itself made a formal promise to its future. At the next town meeting, held by the newly flowing public well, the young pastor and Ethan presented a document. It was a new town covenant, drafted on a single large sheet of paper. The pastor read it aloud, his voice clear and strong, ringing with the conviction he had earned. It was a simple proclamation that no resident of Dust Haven would be subject to public scorn or accusation without at least one piece of verifiable, material evidence being presented to the sheriff. It was a formal, legal rejection of gossip as a tool of power. One by one, the townspeople stepped forward to sign it. The blacksmith, Mrs. Gable, Mary the laundress, the silversmith, and all the others. They put their names to the paper, turning their collective apology into a binding law. The document was framed and hung on the wall of the new town hall, a constant reminder of the price of prejudice and the value of truth. The symbols of their journey remained. Abigail never took off the ring the blacksmith had made. She would feel its solid, unpretentious weight on her finger as she worked, a constant reminder that the strongest love could be forged from the roughest, most common materials, from the things of daily labor. And Ethan wore his badge, but it felt different to him now. He would never forget the moment it sat on that podium, bare and accountable to the people he served. The law, he knew, was not just his to enforce. It was theirs to uphold. As the long, hot summer finally broke and the first cool winds of autumn swept across the plains, the world seemed to take a clean, deep breath. The heat and the dust had given way to a crisp, clear air. One afternoon, Abigail stood outside her new shop. She was tying up a finished parcel for a customer, a repaired saddlebag. The plum-colored ribbon that had been used as false evidence against her was long gone, burned in the fire. Instead, she took a spool of new ribbon, a bright, clear blue, the color of a true sky after a storm. She tied a neat, sturdy bow, a small, quiet gesture of closing one chapter and beginning another. Their life together settled into a comfortable, domestic rhythm, punctuated by quiet humor. Ethan, in his off-duty hours, decided he should learn some practical skills. He presented Abigail with one of his shirts, a button dangling by a single thread. "I believe," he said, his face mock serious, "that I require some instruction from the head of the first aid department." She looked at the shirt, then at him, a smile playing on her lips. She handed him a needle and a spool of black thread. "I believe the law had best learn to mend its own injuries." He took the needle, his large, capable hands, so steady with a pistol or the reins of a horse, looking comically clumsy as he tried to guide the thread. He fumbled, pricked his finger, and muttered something under his breath about the stubbornness of inanimate objects. Finally, he held up his work. The button was attached, but the stitches beneath it were a chaotic, tangled knot. Abigail inspected it with the gravity of a judge. "Sheriff," she said, her voice full of feigned solemnity, "this is a clear case of assault against that poor garment. For this offense, I am sentencing you to 2 weeks of washing the dishes." He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, the shirt forgotten. "I accept the sentence," he rumbled, his lips finding hers. The promise of the future was not just theirs alone. It was the town's. Abigail and the pastor, seeing the need, had started a night school, held twice a week in the church, by the light of a dozen kerosene lamps. They taught the railroad workers and other laborers how to read and write. Big, calloused hands, accustomed to pickaxes and hammers, learned to curl around the slender shape of a pencil, their brows furrowed in concentration as they sounded out the letters that would unlock the world for them. And May, who had been a silent, solemn observer of life, was now a full participant in it. She had recovered from her injuries, and the fear in her eyes had been replaced by a bright, childish curiosity. One evening, as Lyle the mail carrier stopped by on his rounds, she sat him down on the porch steps, but she was not listening. She was reading. She held a small book of stories, her voice clear and gaining confidence as she read a passage aloud. When she stumbled on a long word, Lyle patiently helped her sound it out. She finished the page, looked up at him, and laughed. A bright, unrestrained sound of pure childhood joy that was the new, true bells of the sheriff's house. As the sun set, casting the plains in a deep, magnificent wash of orange and purple, Ethan and Abigail sat on their porch. The day's work was done. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and his arm rested comfortably around her waist. They did not speak of the fire, or the trial, or the darkness they had walked through. They spoke of the small, simple things that made a life. "The new roof on the shop looks strong," she murmured, her voice laced with contentment. "I believe it will hold against the winter snow." "It will," Ethan said. "The blacksmith used 6-inch nails. It is not going anywhere." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant call of a nighthawk. "The water from the well tastes sweet again," she said. "Yes, it does." He looked out at the lights beginning to glow in the windows along the main street. "It is a good town," he said, his voice low. "It just lost its way for a spell." "It found its way back," Abigail replied, shifting to look up at him. "It learned how to say it was sorry." He kissed the top of her head, a gesture of quiet, profound belonging. They had a roof over their heads. They had a well with clean water. And they lived in a town that understood, finally, the difference between a reputation and a character. The last sliver of sun disappeared. From across the square, the church bell began to toll the 9 o'clock hour, its deep, resonant notes rolling across the quiet town. Abigail's gaze drifted to the new sign hanging above her door, the white letters of Wynn's Stitchery and First Aid gleaming in the twilight. She thought of the woman who had arrived on that dusty street, carrying nothing but a sewing machine and a past full of ghosts. She felt the solid, real weight of the ring on her finger and the steady, warm presence of the man beside her. A small, sure smile touched her lips. The shadows had been deep and terrifying, but the light, in the end, had been stronger. Thank you for listening to the story. We would love to hear your thoughts and where you are listening from in the comments below so we can all connect. Please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like this video, and give it a huge boost by pressing the hype button so this story can be shared with even more listeners.